The sun in Egypt doesn't politely ask if you're ready to get up. It arrives like a spotlight on a stage, spilling gold over the desert and making you instantly aware that you've been sleeping on a mat woven from reeds and not the fluffy cloud you dreamed about last night. If you were an ordinary worker, say someone assigned to help with temple construction or moving blocks for a noble's new tomb, your day began early. Not early like a 7 a.m. snooze button kind of early, more like before the first ibis bird decided to make noise early. The Nile mist was still clinging to the banks, and the village roosters, if you had them, were already screaming their opinion that sleeping was for the weak. Your home was simple: mud brick walls, sometimes whitewashed if you were lucky, a flat roof that doubled as a sleeping platform in summer, and very few possessions. Furniture was optional. Most people sat on the floor, slept on mats, and stored their stuff in baskets. Privacy wasn't really a thing. Your family, the neighbor's kid, and possibly a goat that wandered in last night might all be in the same room when you woke up. Step 1, after waking up, find water. The Nile was life, but it was also a commute. You probably kept a water jar in the house, but someone had to refill it regularly. If it was your turn, you walked down to the riverbank, passing fishermen already casting nets and women washing clothes on smooth stones. The air was cool in the morning, so you enjoyed it while you could. By noon, the heat would make you wonder if the gods were testing your patience. Washing your face and hands wasn't just for cleanliness, it was a kind of reset. Ancient Egyptians cared about being clean, but their soap wasn't the foamy kind you know today. It was often a paste of animal fat and ash, gritty enough to scrape away dirt, but not winning any awards for scent. You rubbed it on, rinsed in the river, and hoped you didn't pick up any of the little surprises the Nile occasionally offered. Like leeches, clothing was simple: linen. If you were male, a basic kilt-like garment called a wendat. If you were female, a sheath dress. Linen was light and breathable, which was perfect for the climate, but it wrinkled almost instantly. Nobody cared. You tied it with a belt or sash, maybe threw on an amulet if you were feeling fancy, and you were ready to face the day. Shoes, optional. Most people went barefoot, unless walking somewhere dangerous. Sandals existed, but were often saved for special occasions or rich people. Breakfast wasn't going to be a 3-course affair. Bread and beer, that was the Egyptian classic. The bread was hearty, filling, and often had the crunch of stray sand grains from grinding the flour on stone corns. Beer was thick, nutritious, and low in alcohol, more like a liquid meal than a party drink. Sometimes you added dates, onions, or a smear of honey if you could afford it. If you were really lucky, a bit of goat cheese might appear on the morning table, but don't count on it. The beer wasn't just for fun. It was safer than drinking plain river water, which could make your stomach regret existing. Everyone drank it: adults, kids, probably even the goat that wouldn't leave your doorway. By the time the sun cleared the palm trees, you were on your way to work. For many men in this period, that meant heading toward a building site. Maybe a massive stone monument, maybe a smaller village structure, maybe just repairing flood damage. Work gangs moved in groups, joking, grumbling, and occasionally singing work songs to keep a rhythm. The foreman kept an eye on everyone, not because he was worried about laziness, though that too, but because safety was a real concern. Moving blocks, hauling timber, chiseling stone, all came with the risk of injury. And in a world without modern medicine, even a simple cut could turn into a major problem if you were on pyramid duty. Your tasks might include pulling sledges loaded with stone, mixing mud mortar, or carving smaller blocks into shape. Tools were copper or bronze, chisels, adzes, hammers, and they dulled quickly, meaning part of your day might be spent resharpening them. Wooden mallets and rope were essential. Every block, every beam, every jar of mortar was the result of countless small actions by hands just like yours. Women's work was no less important. Many spent the day grinding grain, baking bread in clay ovens, weaving linen from flax fibers, or making pottery. Others helped with fishing nets, tended small gardens, or cared for livestock. Children helped where they could, carrying water, shooing birds away from drying grain, or delivering messages between homes. No one sat idle unless they were too young, too old, or pretending to be sick, which usually got you caught. The midday break was sacred. Not in the religious sense, though. Everything in Egypt had some connection to the gods, but because the sun was unforgiving, work paused for food and shade. Lunch might be more bread, some beans, maybe dried fish. You sat with your group, swapped stories, and hoped the foreman was in a good enough mood not to shorten the break. After lunch, work resumed until the light began to fade. The pace slowed in the afternoon heat. Even the most demanding overseer knew that pushing too hard risked heat stroke. By late day, you were tired, dusty, and thinking mostly about the cool relief of evening. Returning home, you might stop at a small market if one was set up, a few stalls selling vegetables, fish, or trinkets. Currency wasn't coins yet. Transactions often worked by barter. You traded bread for onions, a pot for beer, or labor for clothing repairs. Social life often happened here. News traveled fast in small villages, and gossip was a free form of entertainment. Evenings were the best time for family. Dinner might be more bread, stews made from lentils or chickpeas, or grilled fish if the catch was good. Families ate together, often sitting on mats, using their hands or wooden spoons. Once the heat faded, people gathered outside, talking, playing. Simple games like Cenote, a board game with a mix of luck and strategy, or listening to stories. The night air was cooler, the stars were brilliant, and the sound of the Nile flowing nearby was as steady as breathing. Before sleeping, you might give thanks to the household gods, protective spirits who kept your home safe from illness or misfortune. Then it was back to your mat, maybe on the rooftop if the weather was good, ready to do it all again tomorrow. For all its challenges, heat, hard labor, and the occasional cobra, life along the Nile had its rhythm. The river flooded and receded, crops grew and were harvested, buildings rose stone by stone. And in the middle of it all were people like you, ordinary workers whose days blended together into the long, patient heartbeat of ancient Egypt. When you live along the Nile, your calendar isn't based on months printed on a wall, it's written in the water. Every year, the river swells with the summer floods, bringing dark, rich silt from far away and spreading it across the fields. To an ancient Egyptian, this wasn't just nature doing its thing. It was Hapi, the god of the inundation, arriving with gifts. And like any important guest, you hoped he was generous, but not too generous. Too little flood meant famine, too much meant your house floating away. For the ordinary worker, the flood season was both a relief and a challenge. Farming paused when the fields were underwater, which meant the pharaoh had a perfect excuse to call on everyone for big state projects, temples, tombs, monuments. The work was still hard, but it kept you fed and on the good side of the officials. Who decided how much grain your family got? Religion wasn't separate from daily life. It was tangled in everything. The gods weren't distant figures you prayed to once in a while. They were everywhere. Ra was in the rising sun, Osiris in the growing crops, Anubis in the solemn rituals for the dead. Even your tools and bread. Ovens might carry protective symbols. You didn't need a priest to remind you to respect the gods. You saw their hand in the wind, in the flooding river, even in the unlucky moment when your sandal strap snapped. Temples were more than just places to worship. They were community centers, storehouses, and sometimes even job sites. You might bring offerings, not gold or jewels, that was for the wealthy, but bread, beer, onions, flowers, or a small carved figurine. Priests performed rituals you couldn't enter the sacred space to see, but the incense drifting out and the rhythmic chanting were a reminder that the gods were watching. The calendar was dotted with festivals, and festivals meant a break from work. Some honored gods like Hathor, goddess of joy and music. Others celebrated the turning of the seasons. These weren't quiet affairs. There was music, dancing, feasting. Sometimes processions with statues of gods carried through the streets. If you were lucky, the temple distributed extra bread or beer. Kids ran underfoot, trying to grab sweets, while adults traded stories and caught up on gossip. Your clothing got a small upgrade for festival days. Maybe a cleaner kilt, or a necklace borrowed from a relative. Women braided their hair with fresh flowers or wore scented cones of wax that melted slowly, releasing perfume. It sounds strange, but in the heat of Egypt, smelling pleasant for more than 5 minutes was basically magic. Entertainment wasn't limited to festivals. Music was everywhere: flutes, harps, sistrums, a kind of rattle, and hand drums set the rhythm for both work songs and celebrations. Dancing wasn't just for joy. It was part of religious rituals. Storytellers passed along tales of gods, heroes, and past kings, mixing history with myth until no one was quite sure where one ended and the other began. But life wasn't all music and celebration. Illness was a constant worry. Without modern medicine, people relied on a mix of practical remedies and magic. A cut might be treated with honey, which actually helped fight infection, while a headache might get an incantation whispered over it by someone skilled in healing spells. Amulets shaped like the eye of Horus or scarab beetles were worn for protection, and you didn't scoff at them in a world where snakes hid in the grain store and scorpions in your sandals. You took all the protection you could get. The changing seasons shaped your year as much as the gods did. After the flood season came planting. Families worked the dark soil together, using wooden plows pulled by oxen, tossing seeds in wide arcs and covering them with rakes. Children chased birds away from the fields, yelling and throwing sticks. By the time planting was done, your shoulders ached, your feet were dusty, and you were hoping the coming months would be kind. Harvest was a community event. Everyone cut grain with flint sickles, tied the stalks into bundles, and carried them. 2 threshing floors. It was exhausting, but there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the storehouses fill. Payment often came in grain rather than coins, sacks of barley or immer wheat that would become bread, beer, and maybe even something to trade. Home life shifted with the seasons too. In cooler months, the family gathered indoors around small oil lamps, mending clothes, weaving, or carving wooden tools. In the scorching summer, the rooftop became the main living space at night, with mats spread under the stars. The air smelled of the river, the smoke of cooking fires, and the faint sweetness of date palms. Social ties were everything. Neighbors helped repair walls after storms, shared water during dry spells, and joined forces for bigger tasks like building boats or digging irrigation channels. Arguments happened, of course. Someone's goat wandered into someone else's garden. Someone forgot to return a borrowed tool. But letting grudges linger was dangerous in a world where you needed each other to survive. The Nile was your clock, your pantry, your highway. Boats moved goods and people up and down the river Papyrus. Pottery, fish, grain, even granite blocks from quarries far to the south. If you traveled by boat, you sat under a woven shade, felt the wind in your face, and watched the landscape slide by, green fields close to the water, fading into desert and cliffs beyond. At the heart of it all was balance between work and rest, between honoring the gods and keeping your household fed, between the predictability of the seasons and the surprises life liked to throw at you. An ordinary worker in ancient Egypt didn't dream of luxury. You dreamed of steady floods, good harvests, healthy children, and maybe an extra jar of beer at the next festival. As the year turned, the cycle began again, the floodwaters rising, the fields turning green, the harvest filling the granaries. And in the middle of that timeless rhythm, you lived your life. Just one of thousands whose hands built the temples, baked the bread, and kept the great kingdom along the Nile alive. In ancient Egypt, family wasn't just the people you lived with. It was your safety net, your workforce, and your future. A household might include parents, children, grandparents, cousins, and sometimes a friend or two who had nowhere else to go. Add in the occasional goat or chicken wandering through the doorway, and you had a living arrangement that was more communal village than private home. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the gods in their temples. Children arrived into the world without much fanfare from officials, no birth certificates, no official announcements. But for the family, the arrival of a baby was a mix of joy and anxiety. Infant mortality was high, so everyone pitched in to keep the newborn alive and healthy. Mothers breastfed for years, both because there was no alternative and because it gave the child the best chance at surviving. Babies were swaddled in soft linen or plant fibers, and for the first few years, they went everywhere with their mothers, balanced on a hip or carried in a sling while work went on. Discipline was direct. If a child wandered too close to the cooking fire or tried to drink Nile water straight from the bank, a quick shout or a light smack was the ancient version of a safety lecture. Most lessons came from watching and imitating. Boys might follow their fathers to the fields or workshops, carrying small tools and learning how to handle them. Girls often stayed near their mothers, learning to grind grain, spin flax, or shape clay. But the lines weren't strict. Necessity had a way of teaching everyone a bit of everything. School existed, but it wasn't for everyone. Scribes were trained in reading and writing, learning to work with papyrus scrolls and reed brushes. For most children of workers, education was hands-on and practical. How to mend a net, plant in straight lines, or spot the difference between a friendly snake and the kind that could kill you. Play was part of learning too. Kids had toys, carved wooden animals, clay balls, little dolls made from linen scraps. They played games like catch, wrestling, or racing along the riverbank. Sometimes they played Sanat, though most just pretended to understand the rules. The line between fun and work blurred. A game might involve carrying small jars of water or helping to herd ducks back into a pen. Marriage was straightforward. Most people married young, often in their teens. There was no grand wedding. ceremony for ordinary folk, more often. It was simply a matter of moving into the same house and being recognized by the community as a couple. Love matches happened, but practicality played a big role. You married someone who could work alongside you, contribute to the household, and hopefully not argue too much over how much beer to brew for festivals. Home life was steady, but not without its little battles. Food was a constant concern, not famine, level fear most years, but the daily challenge of making enough bread, keeping pests away from the grain, and stretching supplies until the next harvest. Rats and mice were unwelcome but clever guests, and keeping them out of storage jars was a battle fought with cats. Traps and sheer determination. Insects were another fact of life. Mosquitoes thrived in the warm, wet season. Flies showed up, uninvited, to every meal. People used fans made of palm leaves, burned incense, or wore protective oils to keep them at bay. None of it was perfect, but you learned to live with the constant buzzing. Illness in the family was a serious event. Without modern doctors, remedies came from local healers, a mix of herbal treatments, poultices, and whispered spells to drive away evil spirits. A stomachache might be treated with honey and herbs. A broken bone might be splintered with reeds. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Death was accepted as part of life, but that didn't make it easier. Families mourned by shaving their heads, wearing special clothes, or leaving offerings for the dead in hopes they would find peace in the afterlife. Despite the hardships, there were moments of real comfort. The smell of bread baking in the clay oven, the cool shade under a sycamore fig tree, the laughter of children splashing in a shallow canal. These were the everyday rewards that made the work worth it. Evenings were often the best time for connection. Neighbors might gather to share a meal, swap news, or help each other repair a roof. Music floated on the air, a simple flute tune, the beat of a hand drum blending with the sound of the river. Seasonal changes brought their own routines. During harvest, everyone's schedule shifted to match the demands of the fields. During festivals, work slowed and the focus turned to celebration. Life was a cycle of repetition, but within that cycle, each day carried its own small dramas. A broken tool, a surprise visit from a cousin, a lucky fishing catch that meant fresh dinner instead of dried. Through it all, family bonds were what held people together. You worked, ate, and rested side by side. You argued over chores, teased each other during long days in the sun, and stood together when trouble came. In a land where the Nile could give or take away everything you had, family was the one constant. You could count on as night fell, the village would quiet, the lamps flickering inside homes, the sky thick with stars. You might hear a baby crying, a dog barking at something in the dark, or the slow creak of a boat moving along the river. And in that stillness, you knew tomorrow would begin, just as today had, with the sun rising over the Nile, pulling you back into the ancient rhythm of work, family, and survival. For most people in ancient Egypt, the world seemed to stretch as far as the eye could follow the Nile. But the truth was, that river was a highway, and your village was just one stop on a route that carried goods, ideas, and stories from far away. Boats were everywhere. Some were small papyrus skiffs, perfect for fishing or crossing to the other bank. Others were larger wooden ships with square sails, moving in slow elegance against the current when the wind was right, and drifting with it when it wasn't. If you had work in another town or needed to move a load of grain, you caught a ride or poled your own craft along the shallow edges. Travel wasn't always glamorous, sitting under the blazing sun on a crowded deck, while goats bleated and someone's jar of fish sauce leaked wasn't anyone's idea of comfort. But from the river, the landscape was different. Palm groves leaned toward the water. Mud brick villages seemed to float just above the green floodplain, and temples rose like bright, painted mountains from the horizon. Markets were the real beating heart of trade. Every larger town had one, and even smaller villages might see a weekly gathering where sellers laid out mats of goods. The smell hit you before you even arrived. Spices and grilled fish, mingling with the dusty scent of woven mats and the tang of freshly cut reeds. You could find just about anything if you had something to trade. Onions, garlic, dates, beer, baskets, pottery, fishing gear, tools, even charms blessed by a temple priest. A fisherman might swap a morning's catch for a set of new nets. A potter could trade a water jar for a bundle of flax fibers. No coins clinked here. The deal was struck with words, gestures, and the weight of trust between neighbors. Foreign goods sometimes appeared, carried by traders from far beyond Egypt's borders. Cedar wood from Lebanon, prized for building and furniture. Lapis lazuli from lands so distant you only heard of them in stories. Perfume oils from Punt, a place said to be lush and filled with exotic animals. These were rare treasures, usually snapped up by wealthy buyers or temples, but occasionally a scrap of something exotic found its way into ordinary hands. A small bead, a drop of scented oil on festival day. Travelers brought news as well. Word of the pharaoh's building projects, of campaigns in the desert, of floods that were higher or lower a river. News moved slower than the current, but when it arrived, it spread quickly, turning market corners into impromptu storytelling. Circles, journeys on foot or by donkey were common for shorter trips inland. Paths wound through fields and desert edges, where the sun could burn you one moment and the wind could chill you the next. Along the way, you might pass herders moving, goats, children gathering sticks, or priests carrying offerings to a shrine. Rest stops weren't inns like today. They were shady trees, friendly homes, or just a sheltered spot where you unwrapped bread from a linen cloth and drank from your water jar. For ordinary workers, travel was often tied to necessity, delivering goods, helping relatives, or taking part in seasonal labor elsewhere. But it was also a chance to see beyond the same mud brick walls and palm groves. You might return home with a new song learned from a stranger, a story about a temple in another town, or a different way to weave a fishing basket. The river itself had its own moods. Some days it was calm, a glassy mirror for the sky. Other days it rose in swirling brown flood, carrying branches, silt, and the occasional unlucky goat downstream. The annual inundation could turn the landscape into a vast lake, dotted with villages on slightly higher ground, their roofs and date palms the only sign of life above the waterline. Navigating then meant knowing the hidden paths, where the water was deep enough for boats, and where it hid. Dangerous currents, trade, and travel weren't just about goods and news. They were about connection. A fisherman in your village might know the faces of traders from towns you'd never visit. A potter's jar could end up in a noble's house 2 weeks' sail away. The grain you harvested could be baked into bread for a temple feast in a city whose streets you'd never walk at night. Docked boats became part of the village scene. Sailors cooked meals over small fires, repaired ropes by lamplight, and told stories of distant places, some real, some clearly invented after too much beer. Children hovered nearby, listening wide-eyed, imagining a world beyond the bend in the river. And yet, no matter how far someone traveled, they almost always came back. The pull of the Nile, the rhythm of planting and harvest, the familiar faces. In the market, these were anchors stronger than any current. Even the boldest traveler knew that in Egypt, the center of life wasn't some far-off city. It was here, in the everyday work and gatherings that tied the smallest village to the greatest monuments. The wider world might send its goods and gossip down the river, but your life was still rooted in the banks you knew best, the same stretch of water where you learned to fish, fetch water, and watch the sun sink into the west. Tomorrow, there would be more work, maybe another trip to the market, maybe just the steady hum of village life. But you knew the boats would keep moving. The river would keep flowing, and your place in Egypt's endless story would keep unfolding. Every so often, life in the village was interrupted by a summons from the state. It might come through the local scribe, or be announced in the market by a man with an official staff and a voice trained to carry over the noise. This time, the message was clear. The pharaoh had ordered a new temple, and labor was needed. Not just anyone could say no. In truth, no one could say no. For many villagers, this was corvée duty, a kind of tax paid in work instead of grain. Men left their fields for weeks or months, traveling to the construction site. The journey might take them upriver by boat, alongside dozens of others, the decks crowded with men, tools, and supplies. You could feel the mix of excitement and apprehension. Excitement at seeing someplace new. Apprehension at the sheer scale of the work ahead. The temple site was a different world, where the village moved at the pace of planting and harvest. The construction zone pulsed with constant activity. Dust hung in the air. The sound of hammers on stone echoed between half-built walls. Overseers moved through the crowd like hawks, watching, calling orders, making sure every man was doing his part. The heart of the work was stone, massive blocks, quarried from cliffs or hillsides, arrived by boat and were dragged into place using wooden sledges over paths greased with water or oil. Teams of men heaved on ropes, their muscles straining, their bare feet gripping the packed earth. The rhythm was as important as the strength, push and haul together, rest together, start again together. Not all the work was brute force. Some men shaped stone, chipping and smoothing it with copper or bronze tools. Others mixed mud and straw for bricks, or carried baskets of rubble away from the site. Skilled artisans carved intricate reliefs into the walls, gods, pharaohs, and scenes of offerings that would outlast the workers themselves by thousands of years. The scale was humbling. Columns rose taller than palm trees, each one hauled, shaped and set with a precision that seemed almost impossible without the machines we take for granted now. Painted walls gleamed in the sun, the colors bright and fresh before the years would fade them. Statues of gods and rulers stared down with serene, unblinking eyes. The workday began early. At dawn, men gathered for instructions, ate a quick meal, often bread and beer, and took their places. Breaks were few. Shade was scarce. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and the dust found its way into eyes, noses, and mouths. Yet, despite the conditions, there was a strange pride in being part of something so grand. Food and supplies were organized by the state. Workers lived in temporary camps, rows of mud brick shelters or red huts. In the evenings, the camp was alive with the sounds of cooking fires, chatter, and songs. Men told stories about home, joked about the overseers, and compared blisters. Some traded small goods, an extra reed mat for a better water jar, a scrap of cloth for a handful of dates. Temples were more than just buildings. They were political statements, religious centers, and symbols of the pharaoh's divine power. The workers knew this, even if they didn't talk about it much. Every block they moved, every brick they shaped, was another mark of the ruler's legacy. And in a way, it became part of the worker's own legacy to a structure that might stand long after his bones were dust. There was danger. A rope could snap, sending a block crashing. A scaffold could give way. Even the heat could be deadly, claiming a man who pushed too far without rest. Injuries were treated, on site, with whatever could be managed: herbs for pain, splints for broken bones. But not every man returned home whole. When the project allowed, workers rotated back to their villages for rest and to tend their fields. They returned with stories of the size of the columns, the strange foods shared in camp, the way the temple gleamed in the morning light. Children listened wide-eyed, imagining the world beyond the bend in the river. Months or even years might pass before the temple was finished. But when it was, the dedication was a sight to behold: priests in white linen, processions of offerings, music from flutes and drums, the smell of incense drifting on the air. Workers could stand at the edge of the crowd and point. I helped build that back in the village. Life would settle into its familiar rhythm again. Fishing nets would be mended, fields planted, grain ground. But now, somewhere in the land of Egypt, there stood a temple that carried the sweat, skill, and silent pride of those who had built it, a piece of their lives set in stone. For most of the year, the life of an Egyptian villager was a steady drumbeat of work: planting in the fertile season, tending crops as the Nile receded, mending nets before the next day's catch, shaping mud brick before the sun set. Work gave life its structure, and the seasons gave it its rhythm. But every so often, that rhythm broke. A festival was coming. The news traveled fast, faster than any papyrus message or scribe's record. A fisherman heard it at the riverside from a trader's boat, and by the time he reached the market, 3 women already knew which god it was for. The children had heard it by midday, because children always heard everything first. And by sunset, even the old man who rarely left his shady porch was muttering about it, smiling in a way he hadn't in weeks. Festivals were more than a celebration. They were a pause, a deep breath, and a reminder that life wasn't just about toil and duty. They could honor great gods whose names were known across all of Egypt. Hathor, Lady of Music and Joy. Amen, King of the Gods. Osiris, Lord of the Afterlife. All they could be for the small. Local gods, the crocodile spirit who guarded a stretch of riverbank, or a protective goddess of grain whose shrine was no larger than a goat pen. Preparation began days, sometimes weeks, in advance. The women of the village baked in shifts, their ovens glowing in the morning coolness. Ordinary loaves for everyday meals gave way to special festival bread, round and golden, brushed with oil and sprinkled with seeds. Some were shaped into figures of animals or gods to be offered at the temple. Honey was mixed in when it could be spared, turning bread into something sweet enough to make children's eyes widen. The brewers worked almost without sleep. Beer was the lifeblood of a festival, and it had to be made fresh too soon, and it would be sour. Too late, and it wouldn't be ready in time. Large jars lined courtyards, each one stoppered with cloth to keep out dust and insects. The smell of fermenting grain filled the air, mingling with the earthy scent of wet clay dot. In the days before, animals were chosen for sacrifice. Goats, sheep, and sometimes cattle were set apart and fed well, their coats brushed until they gleamed. No one spoke of it too much, but everyone knew their fate. For the gods to be pleased, something living had to be given, and for the people to feast, something rich had to be shared. When the morning of the festival finally arrived, the entire village seemed to change overnight. People wore their best linen, washed and pressed until it looked almost white, a sharp contrast to the usual dusty work clothes. Women braided their hair in elaborate patterns, weaving in colored beads or scented cones of perfumed fat that slowly melted in the sun. Releasing a fragrance of lotus and myrrh, children darted between legs, already sticky from stolen dates. Even the animals seemed to sense something was different. Donkeys were restless. Dogs barked more than usual. The heart of the day was the procession. It began at the temple, sometimes a great stone building with towering columns, sometimes just a mud brick shrine shaded by palm fronds. The priests emerged first, dressed in spotless white, carrying sacred objects, amulets, offerings, and most importantly, the god statue. In the largest festivals, the statue rode in a gilded boat carried on the shoulders of men, shaded by a canopy painted with stars. In smaller ones, it might be a simple wooden figure, its features worn smooth by years of devotion. Musicians led the way. Drums pounded in a heartbeat rhythm, flutes piped sharp and clear. Women shook sistra, metal rattles that shimmered in the light, and their steady beats seemed to drive the whole procession forward. Behind them came dancers, moving in carefully practiced steps, their bodies swaying in time with the music. Jewelry of gold, copper, and faience caught the sunlight in flashes. The crowd followed. Some sang hymns, voices rising in unison. Others clapped in time or called out blessings to the god. Children skipped alongside, craning their necks to see the statue. Old men walked slowly, leaning on staffs, their eyes fixed on the sacred figure as it passed. The air was alive with smells: roasted duck, grilling fish, fresh bread, and the sharp sweetness of beer. Food stalls sprang up along the route. Women carried trays of dates, figs, and pomegranates. Men roasted meat over open fires, the fat sizzling and hissing as it dripped into the flames. Some foods were free, given in the spirit of the festival. Others were traded for a small bundle of onions, a handful of grain, or simply a favor owed. As the day went on, the mood shifted. The morning was solemn. The god carried in dignity, prayers whispered, offerings laid on altars. But by afternoon, the god had been honored, and the people turned their attention to honoring themselves. Beer jugs emptied quickly. Songs grew louder and less formal. Dancing spilled from the official procession into side streets, then into open courtyards. Men challenged each other to wrestling matches. Young boys raced along the riverbank, splashing each other. Groups of friends competed in stick-fighting bouts, the clack of wood striking wood, punctuated by cheers and laughter. On the river, those with boats staged playful races, not for prizes, just for the bragging rights of winning in front of the whole village. Spectators lined the banks, shouting encouragement. And more than one race ended with someone falling into the water. To the roar of the crowd's amusement, the festival lasted until the sky turned gold, then deepened into the purple of evening. Fires were lit, casting dancing shadows across walls. Musicians played on, their rhythms looser now, following the sway of dancers who cared more about joy than precision. Couples slipped away into the dark for stolen conversations or shared laughter by the river. Even the priests seemed to relax. The god was safely back in the temple, the offerings made, the duties fulfilled. Now, they too might drink a little beer, eat some roasted meat, and watch the people they served in their happiest state. By the festival's end, the village was full of weary smiles. People stumbled home, carrying leftover bread, half-empty jars of beer, and stories to retell for weeks. Some would return to their work the next morning with aching heads and sore feet, but no one complained. A festival was worth the tiredness, for in Egypt, life was never just about the work that fed you. It was about the moments when the whole village came together, when music and laughter drowned out the sound of the grindstone and the splash of the oar. And as the last embers faded and the quiet of the night settled in, the thought was already stirring. When's the next one? Work and festivals gave Egyptian village life its structure, but what gave it its heart were the bonds between people, and none were more important than the ones built in homes and marriages. Love in ancient Egypt could be practical, political, or deeply romantic, sometimes all at once. It wasn't quite like the dramatic, slow-moving courtships imagined by poets. Here, the Nile's current didn't wait for Debramus. Life moved quickly, and so did relationships. But there was still plenty of charm, shyness, and the occasional sly smile across the market stalls. Most people met within the same small circle. The baker's daughter noticed the fisherman's son when he carried baskets of fresh catch past her doorway every morning. The young potter, delivering jars to the market, exchanged quiet greetings with the girl who sold pomegranates. They might meet again at a festival or during harvest work in the same field, and if the interest was mutual, families would soon take notice. Marriage wasn't usually arranged by distant strangers. It was the business of families who had known each other for years. A man who wished to marry would speak with his parents, who would then approach the girl's family. There were negotiations, where the couple would live, what goods might be exchanged, how the household would be supplied in its first years. Wealthier men might give silver, gold, or fine linen as part of the marriage agreement. Farmers might offer grain, fish, or livestock. It was less about buying a wife and more about ensuring the new household started strong, and yet, for all the practicality, affection was prized. Ancient Egyptian love poems survive on papyrus, full of playful teasing and heartfelt longing. A young man might compare his beloved's voice to the sound of geese calling across the water at dawn, or say her presence was sweeter than beer after a long day's work. Women wrote to describing the thrill of seeing a man walk past, or the ache of waiting for him to return from the fields. Weddings themselves were not grand temple ceremonies. For most villagers, there was no official priestly ritual. The marriage became binding when the couple agreed and moved in together. Still, there was often a feast. Neighbors brought food, musicians played, and the couple's new home was blessed with good wishes, laughter, and sometimes a small shrine in the corner for protection. Life after marriage was busy. The home was more than a place to sleep. It was a workshop, a kitchen, a storehouse, and a nursery all in one. A typical village house was narrow, made of sun-baked mud brick, with a flat roof for drying grain or sleeping under the stars on hot nights. Inside, the walls were plastered smooth, sometimes painted with simple designs, lotus flowers, palm leaves, or protective symbols like the Eye of Horus. Men and women worked together, though tasks often differed. Men went to the fields, fished the river, or labored on building projects. Women baked bread, brewed beer, spun thread, wove linen, and cared for children. But roles could blur. A woman might sell goods at the market, and a man might repair household tools or tend a family. Garden. Children were a joy and a responsibility. From the moment they could walk, they were part of village life. Toddlers played in the dust with toys of clay or carved wood. Older children helped with chores, fetching water from the well, gathering firewood, herding goats. Families tended to be large, both because children were a sign of prosperity and because not all would survive to adulthood. Illness, accidents, and the unpredictability of the Nile made every healthy child a blessing. Family bonds extended beyond the walls of the house. Cousins were raised almost like siblings, and grandparents often lived nearby, passing on stories, songs, and advice. Neighbors, too, were part of the household's wider family, ready to help with harvests, care for children, or lend grain in a lean year. Disagreements happened, of course. A husband who neglected his household, or a wife who quarreled with her in-laws, could cause tension that spread through the neighborhood. But Egyptian legal records show something remarkable for the ancient world. Women had the right to own property, sign contracts, and even divorce. Marriage was a partnership, and though it didn't always run smoothly, both sides had a say in its fate. Evenings in a married household were quieter than festivals, but no less meaningful. A fire burned low as the day's heat faded. Bread baked earlier was shared with stewed vegetables or grilled fish. Children drowsed on mats while parents talked in low voices about the next planting, about the neighbor's new goat, about the price of barley at the market. In summer, the family might sleep on the roof, looking up at a sky thick with stars. The cool night air a relief after the sun's weight. Marriage tied people to each other, but also to the community. Two households became one, and through them, threads of kinship wove tighter across the village. In times of plenty, these bonds meant shared feasts and laughter. In times of hardship, they meant no one faced hunger or grief alone. In the end, love in ancient Egypt wasn't all moonlight and poetry, though there was room for those too. It was work, shared labor, trust, and the quiet comfort of knowing that when the Nile flooded too high or too low, when the wind carried sand into the fields, when illness struck, there was someone beside you and a home to return to. And as the Nile rolled on, just as it had for generations, couples built their lives together stone by stone, loaf by loaf, child by child, their stories as enduring as the river itself. In an Egyptian village, you could measure a lifetime not just in years, but in the seasons of the Nile. Each flood, each harvest, each hot, still summer was another notch in a person's life. And if you were fortunate, if the river treated you kindly, if illness stayed away, if your family kept you fed and cared for, you might live long enough to be called sheik or old mother by your neighbors. Titles given with respect and affection. Old age was both an achievement and a challenge. The years of bending over fields, hauling water jars, and walking dusty roads left their mark. Knees ached in the cool of morning. Eyes, once sharp enough to spot a bird on the far bank, blurred when reading the fine carving on an amulet. But there were rewards for reaching that stage of life. You no longer had to rise before dawn to work the fields every day. Younger hands took up the heaviest burdens, while elders offered something equally valuable: wisdom an old man might spend his mornings sitting in the shade near the market, telling younger fishermen which parts of the river hid the fattest tilapia. An old woman might teach her granddaughters how to braid hair for festivals, or how to season bread dough so it stayed soft for days. In a world without books for most, elders were living libraries, carrying in their memories the unwritten history of the village, who married whom, which flood years were the worst, how a certain dispute had been settled long ago. Still, the body slowed, and everyone knew that the Nile's current only flowed one way. Death was no stranger here. A fever could sweep through the village, an accident in the fields, a bite from a snake, a boat overturned in the river, all could take a life suddenly. But in old age, death was often less an intruder and more an expected guest. The Egyptians feared death far less than they feared being unprepared for it. For them, dying was not the end, but a crossing, a journey from the world of the living to the field of reeds. A paradise where the Nile flowed forever, crops grew tall without labor, and families were reunited. But to reach that perfect afterlife, one had to be ready. Preparation began well before the last breath. If a family could afford it, they would save for a proper burial, linen for wrapping the body, oils for anointing, amulets for protection, and perhaps even a small coffin painted with symbols and prayers. Poorer families might not manage an elaborate tomb, but they still honored their dead with care, washing the body, wrapping it neatly, and burying it in the desert's dry sands, where the heat preserved it naturally. Death was a family and community. Fair neighbors came to mourn, their wailing as much a ritual as an expression of grief. Women might sing laments, calling the dead by name and recalling their virtues. Men carried the body to its resting place, walking slowly in the sun, a sign of respect. For those with means, the burial included offerings, bread, beer, dried fish, onions, and sometimes small figurines called shabti, meant to serve the deceased in the afterlife, so they could rest instead of labor. A scrap of papyrus or the wall of a tomb might bear a prayer to Osiris, Lord of the dead, asking him to welcome the soul into his domain. The most important part of the journey was not physical but spiritual, the weighing of the heart. Egyptians believed that when a person's soul reached the hall of Mat, it would be judged by the gods. The heart was weighed against the feather of Mat, symbol of truth and justice. If the heart was lighter or equal in weight, the soul was pure and could enter the field of reeds. If it was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by a fearsome creature called Amet, and the person would cease to exist. Because of this belief, living a good life was not just about keeping peace in the village, it was about ensuring your place in eternity. Kindness, honesty, and fairness were as important as planting your fields on time. As one old saying went, better a just heart than a full granary. For the family left behind, life after a death was a mix of mourning and remembering. In the weeks after the burial, they might visit the grave, leaving fresh bread or pouring water into the earth so the deceased would not be thirsty. On festival days, they spoke the name of the departed aloud, for the Egyptians believed that as long as a person's name was remembered, they were not truly gone. Old age, too, carried its own kind of immortality. An elder's words might live on in the way a grandchild told a story, or in the way a field was planted just so because grandfather always said the north side catches more breeze. In this way, the dead lived quietly in the rhythm of daily life, as much a part of the village as the living. When the sun set over the Nile, painting the water gold, an old man might sit outside his home, watching children play and thinking not of death, but of the field of reeds, imagining himself fishing in its eternal waters, or walking through endless fields with the wife he had lost years before. For him, the river's flow was no longer just a measure of the year. It was a reminder that one day he too would join the countless souls who had gone before, and that the journey would be as natural as the flood and the harvest. And so, in ancient Egypt, death was not a closing door, but a gate, one that stood, open to those who lived well, loved deeply, and left behind a name spoken in gratitude. The Nile would keep flowing, the crops would keep growing, and new children would take their first steps under the same sun. Life would go on, and in the quiet sands beyond the village, the old ones would rest, waiting for the eternal morning in the land where the river never failed. For most of the year, a small Egyptian farming village was a place of predictable rhythms. The splash of oars on the river, the scrape of hoes in the soil, the soft thud of bread dough on a wooden board. But even the most peaceful of communities lived under the shadow of danger. The Nile gave life, but the wider world was not always as generous. The Egyptians were not constantly at war, but they knew the feel of it. Sometimes the threat came from far away, rumors of a foreign army marching down from the north, or a Cushite raiding band riding up from the south. Sometimes it was closer to home, a neighboring village disputing a stretch of farmland, or bandits lurking along the desert edge, in a place with no police force as we think of it today. Defense was everyone's responsibility. The king might command great armies, but in the countryside, it was the men of the village who picked up spears when trouble came. Weapons were simple but deadly, spears tipped with copper or bronze, bows strung with sinew, slings for hurling. Stones, shields, were often made of wood covered with hide, lighter than the solid bronze plates of royal guards, but easier to carry for long hours. Training was not a constant drill, but boys learned early. A father might show his son how to notch an arrow and judge the wind by the sway of the palm leaves. Older youths practiced in open fields, hurling javelins at wicker targets or racing in the heat until their lungs burned. It was understood. Every man should know how to stand between his family and harm. When the threat was small, like a band of thieves slipping in to steal grain, the villagers handled it themselves. Watchmen stood guard at night, walking the narrow lanes with torches, listening for the splash of oars that didn't belong or the sound of footsteps on dry earth. But when the danger was large, word of soldiers from a rival kingdom crossing the border, that was different. Messengers were sent downriver to the nearest garrison. The royal army was a different sight entirely. Soldiers in ranks, wearing linen kilts, their shields polished, their bows strung tight. Trumpets made from long animal horns blared across the fields, sending shivers through the spines of those who heard them. Villagers watched with a mix of relief and unease. Relief, because protection had come. Unease, because an army's presence was a reminder that war had stepped close. For the soldiers themselves, battle was no romantic affair. Campaigns could last months, taking them far from the green banks of the Nile into the heat and dust of desert marshes. Supplies had to be hauled along, and every man carried not just weapons but waterskins and dried rations. Battles were fought in tight formations, archers sending volleys into the sky, while spearmen advanced in steady steps. In the crush of combat, victory was brutal and exhausting. Villagers back home often learned of the outcome weeks later. If the news was good, there might be small celebrations, prayers of thanks to the gods, offerings at the temple, relief that the Nile's flow of trade and peace would continue. If the news was bad, well, bad news could change everything. When a war went poorly, it wasn't only soldiers who suffered. Refugees might arrive, hungry and frightened, telling stories of burnt fields and collapsed homes. Taxes could be raised to fund more troops. In the worst cases, enemy raiders might push deep into Egyptian land, and then the village's own people would have to flee downriver to safer territory, carrying whatever they could on their backs. Even when battles were far away, war left its mark. Copper 4 plough blades might be harder to find because it was going into spearheads instead. A father or brother might be gone for months, returning leaner, quieter, with a faraway look in his eyes. Children would stare at the scars on his arms, or the chipped edge of his shield, trying to imagine the places he had been despite all this. Egyptians believed deeply in protecting the land. The Nile Valley was a narrow ribbon of life in a wide desert. To lose even part of it was to risk everything. The pharaoh was not just a distant ruler, but the guardian of that ribbon, charged by the gods with keeping chaos at bay, fighting. For Egypt was seen not simply as duty, but as part of the cosmic balance, the eternal struggle of Mat order against Isfit chaos. And so, even in a quiet farming village, the echoes of war were never entirely absent. You might hear them in the distant sound of marching feet on the floodplain, in the tense way people looked upriver when an unfamiliar boat appeared, or in the sudden quiet of a festival interrupted by a messenger bearing news. But most days, peace returned. Spears went back to the corners of storerooms, shields hung on hooks, and the sounds of hammers and laughter once again filled the streets. Fields were replanted, boats repaired, and the Nile's steady heartbeat reminded everyone that life here was built to endure. Yet no one forgot. A spear left to gather dust was still a spear, and a village that had once stood ready could stand. Ready again. In Egypt, as in all places, peace was precious, not because it lasted forever, but because it had been bought and could be bought again, by the courage of those willing to hold the line when the river's quiet was broken. The Nile was more than a river. To the people of Egypt, it was a road, a lifeline, a promise. It connected the smallest mud-brick hamlet to the richest temple city, and beyond that, two lands most villagers would never see except through the goods. And stories brought by travelers. Trade was as old as the first boat to float on these waters. From the south came ebony, ivory, and gold from Nubia. From the east, incense and rare spices from the land of Punt. From the Mediterranean coast came copper, fine oils, and wine sealed in clay, amphorae. Even the humblest village market might hold a few treasures that had crossed deserts, sailed seas, and passed through dozens of hands. Merchants were the wanderers of this world. Some were locals making short trips between villages, their reed boats piled high with jars of beer and baskets of onions. Others came from far away, speaking in accents that curled and clipped words strangely, wearing clothes of patterns no one here wove. A merchant's boat docking at the village landing drew curious eyes, the way a torch draws moths, children eager for trinkets, women bargaining for cloth, men scanning for tools or blades they couldn't make themselves, for a farmer who spent his life within sight of the same palm trees. Trade was a glimpse of the wider tapestry of the world. A Nubian trader's gold bracelet told of mines deep in the rocky south. A jar of frankincense hinted at far-off green hills, where the air smelled of flowers year-round. These goods were more than luxuries. They were proof that Egypt was not alone, but part of something bigger. Travel, however, was not only for merchants. Pilgrims took boats to temples in distant cities, offering prayers in places where the gods were said to be especially near. Messengers sped along the river, carrying orders from the pharaoh, their reed skiffs slicing the water faster than most fishing boats could hope to match. Even soldiers, returning from campaigns, brought back not just stories of battle, but glimpses of strange lands, tales of deserts without rivers, mountains that touched the clouds, or seas so wide you could not see the far shore. For most villagers, though, the river was both boundary and bridge. You might never cross the sea, but you might row down to a larger town for a festival, or up to a different market to sell your surplus grain. Each journey was a reminder that the Nile's current flowed in two directions, carrying goods and news, but also carrying you if you were bold enough to follow it. And yet, for all the movement and connection, life here remained steady in its heartbeats. The years still turned on the same axis. The flood, the planting, the harvest. Children still learned the same skills their parents had, still chased each other down the same dusty lanes. Elders still told stories under the same night sky, pointing to the same constellations their ancestors had seen. War might come and go, famine might threaten, traders might bring wonders, but the village endured. The Nile's water, black, with silt after the flood, still slipped between the fields, feeding the grain that fed the people. The sun still rose golden over the eastern bank, and set in fire behind the palms to the west. Some evenings, when the air cooled and the day's labor was done, a man might sit on the worn step outside his home and watch the river. He would see the boats moving steadily, some small and humble, some great and proud, and think of all the lives flowing with them. He would know that somewhere, upriver, a child was being born under the same sky, just as someone else was being buried in the dry earth. This was Egypt, a place where life was a circle traced again and again, each generation walking the same path, yet each adding its own small mark to the sand. The stories of birth, love, work, hardship, joy, and death were as constant as the current. The details might change, a new kind of net for fishing, a different festival song, a merchant with a new kind of cloth, but the rhythm was eternal, and so the river flowed on. Past this village, past the next, past the great cities, out into the wide world and back again, carrying all of Egypt in its embrace. It was the same river that had seen the first huts of reed and clay rise on its banks, the same that would one day watch temples crumble and new cities rise. The people here understood something simple but profound. The Nile gave life, but it also taught patience. Everything came in its time. The flood, the planting, the harvest, the journey, the return. And just as the river never truly ended, neither did the story of Egypt. The sun dipped low, painting the water in bronze and gold. The last boats of the day slid toward the shore, their sails catching the evening breeze. In the fading light, laughter drifted from the market, the smell of baking bread from the houses, and the soft sound of oars from the water. Night would come soon, and with it another turning of the endless wheel. Tomorrow the river would rise with the sun, and life would begin again, just as it always had, and just as it always would.